Hey everybody, this is John from MTG Nexus coming with you with a Slate deck tech deck overview for Mono Black 8 rack / the newest variant of it, Mono Black Scam, for the modern format. If you do like modern content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. Now, 8 rack is a deck that is sort of akin to Jund or nowadays Rakdos Scam. It is a black mid-range deck that its main goal is to empty your opponent's hand and then kind of win the game from there, most notably with the 8 rack. The 8 rack used to be 4 copies of the rack and 4 copies of Shrieking Affliction, which we'll be taking a look at a different version of the deck. This deck is I have a mixed history with this deck, as some of the most awesome Magic experiences I've ever had in paper were playing against someone who was playing this deck. First one was a gentleman whose name was Odin. Well, I've heard other places it can be a little bit more common. Up here in the Midwest / Northeast, not that particularly common of a name. And then there's the Jesus Turtle story that I'll get into at some point, but not in this video. So, 8 rack, this version is like everything else, playing the broken Modern Horizons 2 cards. 4 copies of Grief, 4 copies of Not Dead After All, 1 Malachite Rebirth. You know this opening. You've seen it from Rakdos Scam. You've seen it from, to a lesser extent, decks like Living End. The Grief double take cards from your hand opening, just devastating in Modern. But when you back that up with so much discard, Thoughtseize, Inquisition, cards you're going to see out of Jund, cards you'll see to a lesser extent out of Rakdos Scam itself, and then pair it up with other cards like Wrenchmine. The deck used to play a card called Smallpox, which forces you to discard. And then the other variant we'll look at, which is the more traditional plays, cards like Raven's Crown. And then you top it off with things like Liliana of the Veil. Your opponent isn't going to have very many cards in hand. This is devastating to certain decks in Modern who are reliant upon either critical mass of spells for decks like Burn, or are reliant on key cards resolving and being in play in order to win, a la decks like Amulet Titan. This deck is very good against those style decks, against the tempo-based decks like Dimir Shadow, or for instance, a deck like is it Murktide, while being a little bit weaker against decks that either play out of the graveyard because you're actively putting things in your graveyard for your opponent, like Living End, or like decks like Omnath Ring or Blue Eye Control with the One Ring, just because they can draw so many cards. If they land one of their haymakers, the game's pretty much over. But beyond that, you do have some pressure. You have Dothy Voidwalker to pair with your discard effects, potentially taking your opponent's big dumb play, winning with it. Orcish Bowmaster is just a ridiculously powerful card, helps against the small creatures, pings your opponent for drawing cards, kind of slices and dices. It does a lot with this deck once. And then 1 copy of Sheoldred, just because you're a black mid-range deck, you should probably be playing some more of this, as it's just an absurd card if it's in play and sticks around. Liliana, we've already kind of talked about it as being an overarching discard effect, but also can eject your opponent, say killing their Murktide, etc. Not the best against go wide decks, but still pretty solid overall in some matchups, especially that involve a little bit more of an attrition-based game plan. Land base, one thing I talk about in coffers, and I talk about it in this deck as well. I'm not sold on 4 copies of Urborg. I understand you want your Urza's Sagas and your Mishra's Factories to tap for black mana. I think 2 or 3 copies is more than sufficient, because that can really give you some awkward hand openings, especially when you pair it with 4 colorless lands with Urza's Saga and 2 Mishra's Factories. You need the utility lands because you need alternative ways to win the game, and then Castle Locthwain as a draw engine. The namesake card, the Rack, is a unique card it's in Modern because of Time Spiral, but it's been around since, I believe, nearly the beginning of Magic. As enters the battlefield, choose an opponent. At the beginning of the chosen player's upkeep, the Rack deals X damage to that player, where X is 3 minus number of cards in hand. Basically, if they have 3 or more cards in hand, the Rack does nothing. If they have 2, it does 1. If they have 1, it does 2. If they have no cards in hand, it does 3. Obviously, you can stack them. It's not legendary. So, to get your opponent's hand empty, you can do quite a nice job of dealing with them. Pithing Needle just as a random catch-all, and Shadow Spear as a way to use your Urza Saga tokens to beat down your opponent. Sideboard kind of shows really what the weaknesses of this deck is. Chalice of the Voids and Void Mirror, different hate pieces against the Cascade decks, especially Living End, but also Rhinos. Definitely need cards for those matchups. Damnation and Fatal Push when you need a little bit more oomph against the creature-based decks. Ashiok also pairs with some of the other things. Ashiok is very good against Amulet, and while it's a slower graveyard hate piece, does work wonders in conjunction with Soul Guide Lantern, Nihil Spellbomb, potentially even a card like Leyline of the Void, if you're expecting a lot of Living End, Dredge, those kind of things, which could be problematic otherwise. Necromentia, an extraction effect, take your opponent's most important thing, whether it be a Primeval Titan for Amulet Titan, whether it be Cashing Footfalls, Living End, etc. This comes in matchups where there's usually a namesake card for the deck. Damping Sphere pairs with Break the Ice, because another deck that absolutely gives this deck fits because it's a black mid-range deck is Tron. So 2 Damping Sphere to Break the Ice, Torak for blue-white X control primarily. Really messes with anything that relies on number of white creatures, so you could also conceivably bring it in against Hammer. And then second copy of Pithing Needle when you expect your opponent to have a number of annoying permanents. Alright, now when I talk about 8-rack, this is more throughout Modern's history what people would expect. And this is basically an almost creatureless or creatureless deck that uses a lot of the cards we've already kind of talked about, and then wins with the Rack and Shrieking Affliction. Now, Shrieking Affliction is templated a little bit differently. Basically, if the opponent has 1 card or fewer, they lose 3 life regardless. So it's nothing. It doesn't scale like the Rack does. It's kind of an all or nothing card, but it is extremely problematic. And slightly differently, also causes life loss. So something like Worship doesn't get around this effect, which, while not relevant most of the time, is something a little bit unique. Deck is very similar to the one we showed before, except a couple copies of Silent Clearing. Land base is primarily the same, although nicely only 3 copies of Urborg. Big fan of that. Blood Chief's Thirst to pair with your Fatal Pushes. And then Bontu's Last Reckoning as a sweeper that comes down a turn earlier, but at the cost of not untapping, which this deck sometimes can be relevant, sometimes not. Black Limb Rogue is a weird one. It's mainly here as a man land that I didn't even know was a man land, or creature in a land. I don't think I've ever seen this one played in any deck, so that's interesting. The fact that you have like this one random creature that your opponent has like no answers to. And then 3 Liliana of the Veil, we already kind of talked about. Liliana, Waker of the Dead. Each player discards a card, each opponent can't, loses 3 life. So once again, kind of plays with the whole deals damage to your opponent has no cards in hand. And -X, where the X is the number of cards in your graveyard, so it can kill things, and then its emblem. Beginning your upkeep on your turn, but target creature from a graveyard on the battlefield under your control, it gains haste. Interesting way to win the game when you're forcing your opponent to discard their creatures. The rest of the deck, nothing too fancy. Most of the stuff we've already seen. Raven's Crime, basically target player discards a card, and then you can pitch extra copies of lands to force your opponent to discard cards. And then Smallpox. This used to be an 8-rack favorite. Each player loses 1 life, discards a card, sacrifices a land, sacrifices a creature, then sacrifices a land. This is a symmetrical effect, so the best way to get around this effectively is don't play creatures. And you don't really care if you're discarding most of the cards in your hands, because they're pretty, most of your cards do pretty much the same thing. You force your opponent to sacrifice a land. A lot of decks operate on a little bit steeper curve than this deck does, so it doesn't care if it's sacrificing lands as long as it has 2 or 3 lands that can usually operate quite nicely. And then, rent another Edict effect that you could do against things like Murktide Regent. Sideboard, you're going to see similar but slightly different things here. 1 of Ghost Quarter helps with the Tron matchup. 3 copies of Dothi Voidwalker. Other anti-graveyard stuff, basically. The other version had the Voidwalkers in the main, so then I paired it with the sideboard hate. This is kind of their sideboard hate along with Surgical Extraction. Not a huge fan of Surgical Extraction being the graveyard hate piece, but it does do a nice job of targeting specific hate card or particular cards, much like what Necromentia does in the other version. only this is kind of an A plus B. You have to discard the card and then extract it that way. Leon's defeat, destroy target black creature or black planeswalker. I'm guessing this is primarily aimed at Rakdos Scam. One of random Death Shadow. Not sure why that's in here. You can't fetch it or anything. I guess it's just a random creature you can catch your opponent off guard with. Ratchet Bomb, Filigree Silence. Basically slow engineered explosives in a deck that only produces one, sometimes 2 colors of mana. Helps against tokens, helps against 1 and 2 drops. So, pairs along with Path of Peril to kind of slow down your opponent. If they're an aggressive deck, Collective Brutality, more discard effects that can also gain you a little bit of life, Disrupt Combo, etc. Good against a deck like Burn especially. Shadow of Doubt randomly catches fetch lands or Primeval Titan triggers, etc. One of it in Staring Bridge as a way to kind of hold back the troops from killing you. And Shatter Assumptions is a weird one. Kind of hard aimed at either Tron or there aren't too many decks that play a ton of multicolor cards. So this feels like it's mainly a Tron weapon. And that is a look at Mono Black 8-Rack. Now, talk a little bit about what this deck's strengths and weaknesses are. Obviously, you're going to disrupt your opponent's strategy, so much like a deck like Rakdos Scam, your opponent can't rely on whatever's in their opening hand to beat you. Oftentimes, they have to out-top deck you. Now, there are plenty of decks in the format that, once they get set up, can out-top deck you. Whether it be Living End, Rhinos, Amulet Titan, if they can set up their resources and top deck a Titan, Tron, Omnath Control, Blue-White Control with a lot of card draw. So there's a lot of decks that can, on the periphery, give problems. Now, Amulet, I think, is a reasonable matchup. Rhinos, I'm not familiar enough. Living End is a bit problematic because you're putting cards in your opponent's graveyard, and if they ever top deck a Cascader with 3 lands, basically you're dead. So there is that. This deck is very much the old Jund thing. Trade resources, trade resources, trade resources. Put a clock in play. Hope you win before your opponent top decks out of it. And to that end, the deck's very good. It generally has very good matchups against the more linear decks, whether it be linear combo, whether it be, decks like Burn, whether it be decks like Someone Amulet, decks like Murktide Regent, decks like Death Shadow. This deck tends to be very good against the kind of linear resource trading 1-for-1 decks. And that is 8-Rack. Oh, the other deck that also it struggles with, graveyard decks. Talked about it time and time again. We're constantly putting stuff in the graveyard for opponent. So we need something like a Dothi Voidwalker or a Leyline Void in the play to avoid decks like Dredge and Living End beating up on us. And that is a deck overview for Mono Black 8-Rack / now Mono Black Scam and some of the latest incarnations. Deck that has been around in the periphery of Modern for some time, and you may not see it very often, but I guarantee you there is someone in your greater area that is a master of this deck and will show up in a random big tournament and surprise you with it. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you like Modern content. Hope to see you for our next video.